I would like to thank the organizers of the conference for inviting me and accepting my paper to the panel. I guess by way of introduction, I am trying to be the grad student that writes the PhD dissertation on the cult of Genghis Khan under Professor Atwood. So today I'll talk about one of the shrine that's related to the Genghis Khan shrine. It's the shrine of Qasar, his younger brother. So in general, there is a very rich culture of shrine worship in Inner Mongolia, and it had a couple of decades of break since the Cultural Revolution until late 80s. So I will read my paper, and so I think that's kind of enough introduction. I think everyone's heard of the Genghis Khan shrine in Artus, right? The Ijinghara, the big museum there now. But yeah, so this is sort of related, but it's in a different place. Yeah, so, okay, after the revival of the 1980s, there was a publication of quite a few books and academic studies of the shrines. So, eager to preserve any remains of the shrines and their accompanying knowledge, the authors of these works appealed to the Mongol script reading public at large with a coherent conception of the tradition. That's the shrine worshipping tradition. They attributed such cultic activities to popularly accepted concepts about Mongolian heritage, typically characterizing them as remnants of shamanism or as examples of ancestor worship. Without undermining the intention of these authors, whose works are the sources for my essay, I would like to show that the contemporary usage of shamanism and ancestor worship are explanatory variables for the shrine study itself. And is itself an extension of the shrine's long-standing function as the vessel of Genghis Khan's sovereignty, which I argue is only possible because of the remarkable flexibility of the idea of sult. So basically, we're still, by calling these shrines, shamanism or ancestor worship, we're still doing what it wants us to do, basically. That's my idea. So because the sult itself is an ambiguous idea, it allows the worship of shrine to be directed at the different ways in which the sovereignty of Genghis Khan's state is embodied at different historical moments, through his person, his associates, his wives, daughter-in-law, his descendant Khans, and the Jasik Nain during the Qing period, as well as now the nation itself, broadly defined. Yeah. So of the three major sites of Qasar worship in Inner Mongolia, in Darkhan Mo-Myangan, Arkhorchen Otuk, I will talk about the Darkhan Mo-Myangan banner shrine worship as the main focus of this essay, although I will compare some things about the other two as well. Yes. So this shrine, the one in Darkhan Mo-Myangan, has uniquely preserved until recent times a set of Qasar's images and a mysterious object of worship, or shute, called Durshot Dagbo. Its ritual activities also included the performance of a set of unique songs whose lyrics and melodies were recorded by the pioneering scholar Durunga in 1958, though unfortunately the recordings have since disappeared, but the lyrics were written down and it's been published. So in addition to these, there are the black battle standard, or sult, of Qasar, along with other objects that are worshipped here, like the sword and the bow and arrow you see here. So the connection between the rituals, the objects, and sovereignty is a set of symbols that pertain to the role of men as active participants of state and as the subjects of the state. In Artus, there are other shrines that worship Qasar through objects, like the Adlik Sult, or the Dapple Standard, and Bure, trumpet, and these are in Artus. And their ritual activities and texts are also consistent with my interpretation. However, the incantation used at the Qasar Awa in Arkhorchen, like prayers from Darkhan Mo-Myangan, directly address Qasar by name. But the ones in Arkhorchen employ a very different rhetoric that exemplifies the shift in the meaning of Qasar worship in the late 20th century. As it is clearly composed much later, the Arkhorchen Awa worship texts are drawn into this essay as a point of comparison with the text from Darkhan Mo-Myangan. In the last part of the essay, I will briefly discuss how these texts capture their meanings from the sult, and how this concept has been used to transfer the sovereignty of Genghis Khan to the ethnic identity of Mongolians in general. Yeah. So here are some photos of the Qasar worship in Darkhan Mo-Myangan. So the description of the ceremony at Darkhamoming is briefly reproduced in the next slide. So unfortunately, none of the authors give the full text of two of the incense offerings that I will briefly mention. They're excluded from my analysis here, but I don't think it affects the interpretation much. So the ceremony itself described here had been performed in the mornings of the 27th day of the 2nd, 5th, 7th, and 10th months. And a Jasik Noying had apparently decided this by decree, according to one of the authors I read on this. In this description, what is immediately obvious is the important role of the local government administration, and second, the absence of a shaman. So in fact, one of the texts praised Qasar for suppressing shamans. So that's why I problematized this idea that this whole shrine worshiping culture is shamanism. There are also a lot more, I can talk about that later. Instead, a ceremonial master entitled Huho is in charge of conducting the ceremony on behalf of the politically powerful. The position of the Huho is inheritable in the sense that he must be a descendant of Qasar himself, but it is nevertheless based on his ability to conduct the ceremonies. As the steps below demonstrate, he is not only important for the performance of the ritual actions, but also, as the last step demonstrates, because the identity of the shrine is in many ways, it extends to his person. So the ceremonial, so here I have the steps on 2 slides. I'll just read through them. The ceremonial master, Huho, announces the beginning of the ceremony, and all present, including the nobles, kneel and spread forward the skirts of their robes, and everyone prostrate their heads. And then the front legs, or ha, of the sacrificial sheep, called uttuk, are broken off and are boiled together with the back, the tongue, and the throat. To sacrifice to the bow and arrows, one jenk, which is a title of a banner-level official in charge of the militia, would hold, while seated, a bow with the jult hanging from it in the shooting position. And jult is kind of like the sheep's head with the throat and lungs and things attached to it. So he holds it on the bow while seated. Yes. And the rest of the sheep would be dismembered and piled onto the 4 great basins placed before the main objects of worship. And these are called the 4 sang. Sang means fount or fund. And it also means incense, but in this case, I think it's more like a fount. The 4 incense offerings would be read. These are Ijin sang, Harsultin sang, Namdak sang, and Durkhut Tabak sang in one source, and Durshat Dagbo sang in another. So the text of these latter 2 I don't have. For a horse with a pure colored coat, white or palomino, would be sacralized, which is called sitirlich in Mongolian, or sitirjullich, by the Hucho. And yes. Okay. So then, by the command of the Jasignoin, the Hucho would conduct the entrustment ceremonies, or datr, by reciting the proper text. The Hucho kneels before the image of the Tadbogd, which means Qasar, and sings the Joluk, it's also called Uchig in some cases, or the prayer. After he is done, the banner Jasik, the high officials, and the elders all bring up their Khatak Simp, or colored silk strips offerings, to the altar and come down from the stage. The Hucho then distributes the sacrificial meat and other food items to everyone attending the ceremony, for which he does not use any vessels or instruments. He either gives the shares directly to the recipients hand to hand, or throws to the front skirt of their robes, which would be held up and gathered for the purpose of catching and holding them. The sacrifice ends with the clashing of the stirrup ceremony, or duro hargolach. One man mounts a white horse and plays the enemy by running off. The Hucho then mounts a white horse to overtake him by cutting in front of him. If the stirrups of the 2 riders collide and make a noise, it is seen as a good omen. The fact that the central figure at the ceremony is a direct descendant of Qasar serves as ample justification to say that the purpose of the shrine is ancestor worship. However, this does not explain why everyone else would come to the sacrifice, especially the crowd, though we must take into account the kin-based terminology used to describe the relationship between a Jasignoin and his subjects. Indeed, the Hucho himself is a part of the shrine, physically manifesting the essence of Qasar to the worshippers as a direct descendant. Yet the fact that the Jasignoin and Jank, both local political leaders, presided over the ceremonies indicates that the ceremony's meaning is directly related to the state. Even if these local notables were descendants of Qasar, it appears that their administrative titles were the main identity through which their role at the ceremonies were determined. This is especially so for the Jeng, because as a rule, the Jeng were not of the Taj rank or not descendants of the Chinggisid house, non-royals. In that sense, the only person doing any kind of ancestor worship in the strict sense is the Huho, who actually acts more like a priest and hence the facilitator of worship, not necessarily the main worshipper. Yes. Another important characteristic of the worship of Qasar is its masculine nature, which also will be elaborated upon later in the context of the images. In terms of rituals alone, the bow in the shooting position held by the Jeng in step 2, and the incense offerings to Chinggis Khan and the black suit in step 3, and the sacralizing of horses, step 4, and the clashing of the stirrup ceremony, step 8, all mark feats of military skill, and thus masculinity by association. In the related Awa sacrifice to Qasar in Arkhosjen, women were not allowed to enter the ceremonial area, and they are not allowed to ascend the platform with Chinggis Khan's black suit in Ijunhara even today. Moreover, the sacrifices in both of these locations, an offering of wild game is included. It's called Borguru Sungutuk. In a description of the mottled sult or Atlik sult worship in the Otuk banner of Artus, after the officials and elders receive their shares of the sacrificial meat or hishik, the other participants would fight for their own share from a pile of meat on a large square cloth in the middle of the shrine sanctuary. The meat is also never touched with a sharp instrument, and all must eat with their hands and teeth. After they eat this meat, everyone would mount their horses with their weapons and go for a ritual hunt called Myangung Ao. The first rabbit or deer shot would be brought back and sacrificed to the shrine again, which is named Borguru Sungutuk. And the man who shot the animal is honored with gifts from the funds of the Jasik. As related shrines attest to, subservience to the state is a central feature of the way Qasar and his inspiration for masculinity is celebrated here. In this context, the fact that the Jasik works for the Qing Empire is not immediately relevant for the local context. It suffices that he is the local ruler, and it is his role to continue holding and funding the Qasar ceremonies, whose sacrality does not derive from any current regime, but from the sacred relationship between the Mongol men and their state. The key action that ensures that the men, soldiers, hunters, participants, take on the subservient status with respect to the state is in the way they eat the meat. As one of the authors that I read, Sajr, points out, the only historical text that discusses the question of eating meat without a knife is the decree of Mantraisten imposed against the art, which he attributes to a similar practice of lifestyle. Using the same juxtaposition, I argue that the eating of meat without a knife is a method of ritual humiliation, or a marker of a subservient status, and through this meaning it is relevant in the context of the shrine. It is safe to assume that nobody goes to the ceremony to be humiliated, but the flip side of humiliation is the elevation of the shrine. By ritually taking an action that is supposed to be demeaning, the effect is to categorize submission to the spirit of Qasar, and therefore to the state, as a mark of masculinity. Thus, the essential parts of masculinity is about rendering military service to the state and receiving rewards for achievements in this regard. The communal nature of the hunt, the military, and the attendance to such male-only rituals marks the masculine identity, and these markers are all ways to connect personhood of these participants directly to the state through the shared worship of Qasar as the divine ancestor and as a fount of masculine powers. Masculinity is also of immediate relevance to the portrayal of Qasar at Momyangga and is essential to the deification of Qasar. In the origin stories of the main objects of worship here, transgressive features lend power to the sacrality of the shrine and simultaneously equate the state with the essence of Qasar. Since sacred powers are sent down to the earth and bestowed upon specially gifted people like Chinggis Khan and Qasar, manifesting in their ability to form the state, preserving of their essence after their bodily death is the underlying logic of maintaining the identity between the state and the sacred. This rationalization is in the beginning very similar to the generalized idea of sacred kingship, the definition of a cosmic polity by Marshall Salins and David Graeber. So they say that kings are imitations of gods rather than gods of kings. The conventional supposition that divinity is a reflex of society, notwithstanding, as a corollary, there are no secular authorities. Human power is spiritual power, however pragmatically it is achieved. In this cultural framework, a privileged relation to the meta-personal rulers of the human fate is the raison d'être of earthly social power. Moreover, as demonstrated in worldly accomplishments, this access to meta-human powers may have subjugation effects on people beyond those directly affected by the acts of the persons of authority. It's charisma in the original God-infused sense. So that's what they say about sacred kings, and I think it's very similar to what we have here for Genghis Khan. The Mongolian sources we have, such as the Secret History of Mongols, down to the chronicles about Genghis Khan's life that Professor Atwood earlier talked about, the Altentovch, etc. That is the narrative told by his descendant rulers, from his children and grandchildren down to far-off descendants, all characterize Genghis Khan as someone very similar to this archetypal cosmic king. As time wears on, Salins and Graeber theorizes, an inevitable decline and dilution of this charisma occurs, thanks to the proliferation of direct descendants of the kings and the number of generations separating the heir to the throne and the original divinely blessed king. A basic problem of preserving the charisma of the king is needed. The Mongolian case is striking for both the readiness of the conceptual framework as well as the physicality of the objects that house this charisma, or sult, in the practice of worshipping shrine tents. As mentioned earlier, the main objects of worship at the shrine were the double-sided portraits, Dur, or of Qasar, and the Dotno Dashdorj Pount. The portraits were drawn in red ink on two sides of a piece of yellowish silk material. One side is a simple drawing in bold lines of Qasar's peaceful emanation, or Amartlangoy Dur, which is a typically bearded figure of a man with a bow on the right shoulder and the tip of the sult behind his left shoulder. The right ear flap of his hat is sticking up as if blowing in the wind. The other side has a dark painted figure whose round eyes, mouth, and earrings are just discernible in the only remaining photo reproduction. This is the fierce emanation, or Dakshin Dur, and these were photographed by Professor Durunga in 1958, and the material itself has now disappeared, but we have the photograph still. The practice of drawing the same person's likeness on two sides of the same cloth is rife with metaphorical meanings. To begin with, it is impossible to behold both images at once, just as it is impossible to see a person in two emotional states, to which the portrait names refer. If we take the identity between the Khan and the state as a starting point, then it follows that it is not possible to behold the benevolent and fierce faces of the state at the same time. Indeed, the institution of the state itself is a deeply ambivalent one. It provides safety and justice through social organization, yet it can only achieve this end by gaining the power of life and death over its subjects. Dashdorj Pount is sometimes mentioned as the Buddha Dashdorj Pount, or Dashdorj Pount Бурхны шүтэн, and the incense offering to it is described by one author as having Buddhist influences. The legend of its origin, however, shows that, that regardless of its Buddhist features, it is the fear of violent death and harsh punishments, and by extension of the state, that gives this object its spiritual power. The story is, a long time ago, a man found guilty of theft was flayed while alive. That is, his skin was peeled off. And he swore as he died that he will prevent the same suffering he has endured by making sure no one dares steal again. His bones are the Dashdorj Pount. The point of such reminder of the horrific harsh sentence is in the spirit of evoking awe of the state's moral power, and not to criticize any disproportionality between crime and punishment. Moreover, the legend makes no mention of whether Qasar himself was the sovereign who gave this punishment. That is, the identity of the Khan is in this case irrelevant. Thus, the thread of the law that this legend preserves is from the state itself. The common element of these two objects is the inclusion of some amount of the human anatomy, blood and bones. Each of them are transgressive of the society's taboo on keeping human detritus. Dead bodies had been buried with possessions and companions in the pre-Buddhist world, but in the centuries until now, laying in the open, burials and cremations have been the norm for funerary practice in Mongolia. There are, of course, other ways of seeing this practice. Use of a sacred deceased blood for enshrinement is not unique at this shrine. A similar legend exists for the Holan Khatan shrine, which we just heard about in Artus, which had an object of worship allegedly painted with the blood from her nose and mouth at the time of her death. And it is also known in the Tibetan Rite Buddhist traditions. Moreover, enshrining a human likeness for the purpose of housing the spirit is widely known in Inner Asia through the felt dolls, or ongot, They capture some bodily essence of the deceased, acting as storehouses for the last breath that exited the person, and thereby gain a spiritual meaning. However, I argue that the visceral nature of blood that flowed at death has qualitatively different meanings from that of the Ongot, and in addition to preserving the personal essence of Qasar, it is a powerful way to preserve the essence of Genghis Khan's state. And one religious studies scholar, Michael Tausig, says that transgression is an essential part of the sacred. It is the limit that comes into being when crossed. That is precisely because no one should be making portraits of the dead with the dead's own blood. These objects are by definition not just unique, but out of this world. Regardless of whether it is actually true, the legend, all that matters is the meaning given to these relics. They are of Qasar in the case of the portraits and disturbingly unique in the case of the Dushat Dagbor, and therefore they cannot be reproduced. The ways in which Qasar worship has progressed in recent decades after these transgressive objects are lost is telling of their meanings. It appears that the memory of these relics, casually explained with ancestral shamanistic beliefs, continue to serve to redefine the meaning of these shrines to the community that sacrificed to them. This is apparent in the continued ritual activities in addition to the documentation of the memory of former ways of worship in books. Interestingly, some authors even actively advocate for making the shrine a tourist attraction, which is manifestly a wish to see the shrine recognized as a destination for pilgrimages. The extension of the shrine's sacrality is therefore universalistic for Mongols, and that is, they are not merely a family shrine. So what has become of the shrine today? In addition to the sacred objects, even the Khans and the Jasignoyans have long since disappeared. And so now the main concepts invoked So now the main concepts invoked to argue for the continued importance of these shrines are ancestor worship and the preservation of the ethnic heritage, and they deserve our serious attention. How such meanings can be seamlessly attributed to the formerly state-based and the Khan-centered sacrality attests to the flexibility that ambiguous objects have for adapting to the changing ideological and political situations. We are lucky that many of the prayers which express the ritual specialists' own view of their ceremonies have been preserved and published. And so I would like to share a few excerpts from the text to present a textually grounded view of the aforementioned interpretations. So I'll talk about these four of these texts in tiny excerpts. So first I'll talk about the songs. The texts found at the Darkha Momyanga shrine are not limited to incantations and prayers, but also include a set of lyrics of songs formerly sung at the sacrifices. I will compare these to a stylistically much more recent prayer for sacrificing to the Qasar Awad or Cairn in Arkhashchan today. So, and thereby describe the conceptual relationship over time between the Khan, the state, the people, and the Qasar shrine. The leaders of the Darkha Momyanga banners Khoshchins, who had maintained a friendly alliance with the Manchus since before the Jurchens named themselves Manchus, kept their title as Khan until the 17th century. And so the earlier materials found at the Darkha Momyanga shrine contain numerous references to the Khan, specifically the descendant Khans, or Khan Urs. Nevertheless, the texts are not simply for ancestor worship, but are actively reaffirming communal identity. Comparing how the meaning of descendant changes over time until modern times, during which the Arkhashchawa prayers were composed, helps us understand how the meaning of Qasar sacrality has shifted. The earlier text I show here, I'll just skip to the songs themselves. Yeah, so consider this song here, Irhteos, or Water with a Bank. The concept that these three pieces having, I'll show three songs here, is the necessity of having a Khan in society. In Water with a Bank, the Khan and the people seem to form two interdependent entities that exist in tension, as the people have the latent tendency to overflow their boundaries like a river that floods and destroys, and thus must be reined in. And here's another one. The alert of the moose here gives the same idea from the perspective of the people, who follow the Khan out of their own volition, for their own good, though they are also fated to do so. There is a telling parallel between a prey animal's agency, which is also instinctively conservative, and the people's fate. Fate is not seen as a spiritual idea. It is as pragmatic as animal instinct. So here's another song. The third piece, The Ornament of Space, or is a concise portrayal of the cosmology in place here. The last line is particularly important as it pertains to the Mongolian political theory of Ulstur that has been of significant scholarly interest. Here I have translated Idung as Lord. Us, which has been translated as country or subject, clearly refers to the political entity formed by the people, but must be led from above. That which accomplishes this task are their master or lord, and the state or tur. Here, the exalted pairs in each sphere in the cosmos can be seen as a constellation of the sacred: the sun, the moon, the khan, the hero, Batr, the Hawa, cairn, the Shutin, object of worship or fetish, the lord, and the state. So here's an incense offering to the black sult. So as mentioned in part 1, the ceremony rituals begin with incense offerings to Chinggis Khan himself, and then to the black sult. Towards the end, the text finally states that the black sult to which the prayers were directed is actually the one of Chinggis Khan, not the relic enshrined at the shrine for Qasar. This curious fact, offering incense to Chinggis Khan's black sult to honor Qasar's black sult, suggests that seeing these shrines as cults of personality is untenable. The Qasar shrine is not set up in competition with the Chinggis Khan shrines. Instead, the culture of keeping the separate cults, including this one of Qasar, should be seen in the context of a shrine state, and that each shrine is a different aspect of the essence of Chinggis Khan's sacred kingship, his state. In the case of Qasar, his association with qualities of martial prowess and loyalty makes him something like a personification of the black sult, which is in turn the fierce aspect of Chinggis Khan's essence. These lines are from the incense offering to the black sult, and they make the essence of the shrine state abundantly clear in the association between the sacred, the state, justice, and the sovereignty of the Khan. As these lines also make apparent, the concept of the sult is perfectly situated to capture that which is sacred about Chinggis Khan, the person. After all, in this text, it is to his sult, not to him directly, that the sacrifice is directed. So here's another incantation or prayer. This is particularly interesting in light of another feature of Salin's and Graeber's theory of kingship politics, the paradox of sinking status, which I earlier mentioned, which describes the inevitability of the living king having to compete with the dead. And this is the paradox is fundamental reason for the behavioral patterns for kings in young states: relentless conquests, grand building projects, ever greater ritual sacrifices, etc. In the face of this problem, the concept of sult is a perfect technology for simultaneously containing and harnessing the raw power of the sacred ancestral king. The semantic meaning of the sult seamlessly slips between referring to Chinggis Khan or Qasar, the man, and to their disembodied deified spirit within the space of a few lines. The precise definition of the sult as simply the charisma, which is almost a synonym of spirit, albeit with less baggage, is therefore inadequate. In the beginning of another text associated with the shrine, which is an incantation to pour libation to Qasar sult, the following lines pay homage to the supernatural origins of the royal line. The sult itself is born from supernatural parentage, and are either given credit for their human counterparts' military accomplishments, or this distinction is simply not drawn. It follows that the sult is a part of the personhood of Qasar, a thing which can be flexibly identified with the state, the one founded by Chinggis Khan, that is, and elevated to the status of any deity. Noticeable in this and other prayer texts at Darkham Momyangam, Buddhist language is appropriated into the Chinggis Khan shrine worship, but I argue not in a way that alters its core character. At its core, the shrine is about the relationship between the people and the sovereign, the latter of which did indeed take a radically different political position in the 17th century, when the Manchu emperor became the overlord of the Hoshchin. Nevertheless, at the local level, it appears that the shrine state continued to reaffirm the centrality of a sacred institution that traces its origins to Chinggis Khan, which I call the sovereignty of Chinggis Khan, based on the actual text recited at the shrine rituals. And I contend that the logic of the shrines are so flexible, perhaps because of its inherent ambiguities, that the identity of the Mongols as Chinggisid subjects under the protection of his Sult continues to serve as the nexus between the people and the state and the ceremonies. Even if the Jasik were paying homage to the Qing state, they continue to embody the sovereign state of Genghis Khan at their native banners. And this identity should not be seen as hypocrisy, but as a mark of the shrines and the Sult's resilience. So here is a little excerpt from the Hoshchin shrine. I'm almost done now. The flexibility continues to hold true today as evidenced in the Hoshchin worship text. Since the 20th century, it has become abundantly clear that the Khans and their less glorious Jasik descendants are gone for good. And one may even think that the tourist attractions and museums built by the People's Republic of China at the end of the 4 centuries of foreign overlordship spells a certain demise for the shrine's original functions. However, the revival of the Qasar worship has taken a most interesting turn in the last 30 years, since the ceremonial activities restarted in 1989. In the Hoshchin text, which is obviously a recent composition, concepts of ethnic identity and the communal group names loom large in place of the missing Khans. In this text, there are fewer references to the Sult, and instead, Genghis Khan and Qasar themselves are addressed as deities. Juxtaposed with more familiar sacred entities like the sun and the moon, the Hormostingir, and the masters of the land, in the absence of the descendant rulers, the human embodiment of the sovereign is no more. This situation is very different from the one envisioned in the song lyrics discussed above. Though the ritual text from Darkhan Momyanka also deified Genghis Khan and Qasar, especially through the concept of the Sult, the mention of the descendant Khan and the historical fact that the descendant Jasik presided over actual rituals meant that the actual rulers had a mediating presence. The Hoshchin text has adapted to this lack of a mediating caste of political elites by realigning the oppositional entities. Identification of Genghis Khan and Qasar as the ancestors of all Mongols, the Mongol Bogdus, the sworn ancestors of Mongolia, the sworn guardians of race/ethnicity/nation, means national entity is now the mediator between the people of this land, the Hoshchin banners, and the sovereign. The first 20 lines of this lengthy verse is full of examples using the national identity. So I'll just look at the conclusions now. The awe-inducing objects besides the weapons at the shrine, together with the generally militaristic ritual actions, are all related to the masculine identity of the shrine, of Qasar, and of identifying masculinity with state. It is no wonder that even though many of the relics are now lost, Qasar worship continues with languages and symbols familiar to our time. His portraits are being reimagined in hyper-masculine guises, even as ceremonies continue to be performed by those who identify themselves as both descendants of Qasar through their banner affiliations and simply as Mongols. Though the Qasar shrine does not have an immediate political function today, and the communities that continue its rituals de-emphasize its various potential meanings in favor of its role as a cultural heritage site alone. The function of the shrine worship as an ethnic marker is in fact a powerful one, especially in face of a remarkable array of assimilative pressures that threaten the Mongolian identity in Inner Mongolia. The successful recasting of the royal ancestor as the father of the people has reconstituted the shrine complex as a marker of ethnicity, and the sacrality of Genghis Khan is now conferred directly upon the people, whose reaffirmation of their ethnic identity connects them to the shrine. And the prayers at the shrine confer the blessing of the holy ancestors upon the worshippers directly. That's all I have today. Thank you.